When we think of the story of video games, often we think about the narrative that we experience during the course of it. But what about all of the surrounding stuff? Everything about the world, the history, and the people that you find out while playing a game. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on Gameranx, 10 games with mind-blowing lore. Starting off with number 10 is the Dark Souls series. When you think of lore in video games, what's the first thing you think of? For me, it's Dark Souls. It's weird because unlike most other lore-heavy games, there are very few notes or books to read through. There's very little exposition, and what is there is very vague, very confusing, but that's what makes the lore of this game so compelling for so many people. It doesn't spoon-feed the players anything. You can totally ignore the history and backstory and just kill stuff if you want, but for many players, one of the great joys of this series comes from exploring a dense kingdom and piecing together what exactly is supposed to be going on. The first cutscene of the very first Dark Souls game does so much heavy lifting in the lore department, it's crazy. It pretty much explains everything from the War of the Gods and the Dragons to the appearance of the Dark Soul and so much more, but it barely matters when you first start playing the game. And it's not until around the halfway point that you realize just how important all that exposition was and how necessary it is if you want to understand what's even supposed to be happening in the game. Outside of the opening lore dump, everything else you learn about the world comes from talking to NPCs. Environmental storytelling and the short descriptions that come with most of the items and gear you pick up. That's it. It's also disjointed and short that it's easy to ignore as fluff at first, but if you really look into it, there's connections everywhere. Actually, knowing this stuff rarely matters, but it does add a lot of depth to the experience. Like knowing who Artorias the Abyss Walker is makes it so much more impactful when you actually encounter him. That's what makes the lore of Dark Souls so engrossing. It's in-depth enough that you can see how the backstory bleeds into the game world, but it's vague enough that the player's imagination is allowed to run wild. I remember the first time I got to Anor Londo and realized this place was the city of the gods they talked about at the beginning, and it was a mind-blowing realization. I have been fascinated by the lore of this series ever since. At number 9 is Mass Effect 1 through 3, and how Mass Effect handles lore is about as far from Dark Souls as possible. It's clear, it's well explained, and it's easily accessible from an in-game encyclopedia. And it's not necessarily as mind-blowing because of how mysterious it is, though there are some pretty interesting mysteries in the backstory, but the reason I think it's so great is it's just well made. The world of Mass Effect is a really great sci-fi universe with a lot of interesting things going on in it. Pretty much every species in the game has something interesting about them, whether it's their politics or their relationships or more mundane stuff like their life cycles and diets. Clearly a ton of time was put into creating this world, and all that backstory and lore does a lot to make the story of Mass Effect seem like more than just another cookie-cutter sci-fi shooter. Say what you want about the actual stories of these games, but all the history and backstory they've imbued into every race and character just adds so much to this game. And being able to access it all by opening the in-game encyclopedia is just awesome. You can spend hours just digging through the codex, and it is actually really enjoyable to do so. The information is concise but detailed, and the narrator combined with the relaxing background music really only adds to the experience. This is a series where it's fun to learn the backstory, and they do a great job incorporating all that lore into the game as well. Stuff like the Genophage and the Geth-Quarian conflict play a huge part in the story, and if they didn't do such a good job setting everything up, then I doubt most players would really be that invested. Even after the incredibly divisive ending to Mass Effect 3 and the disappointment of Mass Effect Andromeda, people are still hyped for Mass Effect 4, and a big reason why is the lore and universe BioWare created. It's beloved for a reason, and hopefully they're able to get things back on track for the next game. And number 8 is The Legend of Zelda. For many, many years, most people thought that the Legend of Zelda series was just a collection of disconnected adventures that seemed to have recurring elements, but nothing more. Some fans speculated about a possibility that all the games were actually connected, but it was all just a bunch of talk until Nintendo released the Hyrule Historia, a book back in 2011, which contained an actual timeline of the Zelda series, confirming there actually was a connection between the games. Sure, sometimes there were hundreds or even thousands of years apart from one another, but they were connected. Before that, there were already some sequels that everybody knew about, like Zelda 2 being a direct sequel to Zelda 1, or The Adventure of Link on the Game Boy being a sequel to Link to the Past, but stuff like Wind Waker and its Endless Ocean didn't seem like it could possibly be in the same timeline as the other games. And that's what makes The Legend of Zelda lore so mind-blowing. For whatever reason, the same event just keeps happening over and over again in the history of Hyrule. There's a green tunic wearing hero named Link, a princess named Zelda, a villain named named Ganondorf and this powerful artifact called the Triforce. How things actually play out can vary wildly between games, but in general, these are the recurring elements, and they seem to happen again and again, even when they're decades or centuries apart from one another. To make things even more confusing, there are split timelines to explain certain inconsistencies, even though there are other consistencies the timeline doesn't address. If you think about it too much, the whole thing doesn't really make a lot of sense, even if you accept that the same thing keeps happening again and again. Just the fact that the original Legend of Zelda game on the NES is actually one of the last games on the timeline is sort of mind-blowing, especially because the timeline implies that it only happens because the Hero of Time actually lost during the events of Ocarina of Time. With Breath of the Wild being the canonically last game in the series now, the timeline should probably start being a little more straightforward from now on, at least. At number 7 is the Witcher series. Originally based on a series of novels and short stories, it's no wonder the Witcher series of games had such dense and intricate lore. In comparison to something like Mass Effect, where your character often deals directly with the political issues of the universe, the Witcher series, you have a different relationship to it. You're often just a party to what's happening, rather than someone directly engaging in it. Geralt considers himself neutral to a fault, and even though you end up dealing with huge world-changing events, what makes Geralt different is that he's usually just trying to stay out of it. So there's all this interesting political stuff going on in the backstory, but you play as a simple dude who just wants to hunt monsters. All that stuff going on currently is interesting in its own right, but probably the most mind-blowing part of the backstory is an event called the Conjunction of the Spheres. See, there was this huge cataclysmic event that occurred in the distant past where alternate dimensions merged into one, an event which brought all the monsters and creatures that the Witcher actually hunts into the world, along with magic and other strange phenomenons. That alone is pretty wild, that the creatures you hunt in this series are basically aliens. But what's wilder than that, at least according to the elves and dwarves, humans weren't actually the natural inhabitants of this world at all. They only arrived during the conjunction and were basically barbarians that destroyed the old civilizations of the non-human races that originally inhabited this planet. It's an almost sci-fi backstory to what is otherwise a mostly low fantasy setting, which is pretty unique. All in all, the Witcher setting is just really well developed and interesting, and it's got tons of great characters and untold backstories that adds a ton of depth to Geralt's adventures. And number 6 is the Destiny series. Now, here's a series where there's a pretty hard disconnect between the lore and the actual games. Most people who play Destiny 2 casually probably know next to nothing about the story or the themes or the many interesting secrets hidden in the lore, and that's okay. That's kind of what makes the lore in Destiny so interesting. It's not essential at all to actually play the game, and you can get by just fine without it. But for the people who really dig into it, all this lore really expands the story in interesting ways. So while stuff like the Red War campaign that's not even playable anymore in Destiny 2 can come off as kind of generic and uninteresting, the actual backstory that's going on is really well done. I think for players who are more interested in the lore, the recent seasons leading up to the Witch Queen expansion do a good job of incorporating the outside lore of the game into the actual gameplay. Locations like the Dreaming City also added a lot to the game lore-wise, not including the fact that the Forsaken expansion actually has a full-blown lore section that you can view in-game. With Destiny, it for a long time felt like you were playing two different games. That's how divorced the lore was from what was actually going on. Recently, Bungie's kind of been finding ways to incorporate all this lore into the game in a more natural way, and that's great because the whole story of the Darkness, the Traveler, the various alien races, especially the Vex, it's all really fascinating. At number 5 is the Remedy shared universe. Remedy, the developers of Max Payne 1 and 2, Alan Wake, and Control, have always been very good storytellers. They were some of the first in the business to really take story seriously in video games while still having a strange comedic edge and willingness to break the fourth wall from time to time. As game makers, they're not afraid to swing big, and with Control they took a really big swing. Thankfully, it paid off. Control is a very lore-heavy game, and it takes place in a world that's half SCP Foundation, half the X-Files, and has a little bit of Twin Peaks surrealness thrown in. You spend the entire game exploring the oldest house, the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Control, and the place is just wall-to-wall filled with notes and video files that help explain the strange backstory of the building. Along the way, you eventually start finding notes about someplace familiar if you're an Alan Wake fan. They mention the town of Bright Falls and describe what happened there as another altered world event. Alan Wake and Control were actually part of the same universe. A later DLC followed up on it, and the remastered version of Alan Wake, they even included a Control Easter egg that ties the two series together even more. Just the fact that there is a Remedy shared universe at all is pretty mind-blowing. It really adds to the mystery and depth of both games, and it only makes us more interested in what could possibly happen in Alan Wake 2. And number 4 is the Nier series. Few games have lore as absolutely nuts as Nier. I mean, this series starts off as a continuation of a secret ending to a completely different series and begins in a post-apocalyptic 2049 in a prologue before skipping forward over 1,000 years to 3361, where the game looks more like a high fantasy setting. It's insane that this series is actually a stealth sequel to the Dragon Card games. The first game in that series already had a crazy enough ending where you're dragon rider from a fantasy alternate universe version of Europe arrives through a portal and ends up in the real world version of Tokyo before getting unceremoniously killed by a cruise missile. That's the backstory to Nier. That this event brought magic into the real world and nearly wiped out the human race. I'm not even going to get into the whole story of the first Nier game, it's so complicated, but there's obviously a lot going on. But it only gets more wild with the sequel, Nier Automata. Why? Because Automata takes place almost 10,000 years later. The year they give for that game is 11945. That's how far into the future we're talking, and so much crazy stuff has happened since then. This is a universe where between the games, humanity goes extinct, aliens invade Earth, and aliens create an entire machine race to serve them, and then all the aliens get exterminated by their own creations, and that's a small part of the backstory. Seriously, the timeline in the Nier wiki is so wild, so much crazy stuff happened in this game's universe, and you only play a small part of it. The Nier universe is bleak, bizarre, and sometimes hilariously goofy, but that's just what makes it so engrossing. And number 3 is the Kirby series. If there's one series I never expected to find deep lore for, it is this one. Yeah, we're talking about Kirby, the game series where you control a little pink ball and suck up enemies. For whatever reason, these games have some of the most complex lore of any Nintendo series. Also, it's something that's so easy to miss if you're just playing these games casually. But if you're a longtime fan of the series, then it's hard not to notice the certain little details that gets called back in future games. I was pretty late to the game on this one actually, but the point where I realized there was some serious lore going on was in Planet Robobot. At the end of that game, you face off against this planet-sized supercomputer called Star Dream, and when you do enough damage to it, the thing suddenly has a face that looks exactly like the Galactic Nova from Kirby Superstar. Why the developers felt the need to add this kind of lore to the series, I have no idea, but it definitely makes things more interesting. There's so much to find if you really want to look into it, and it's surprisingly dark and strange. The fact that Kirby has lore at all is kind of mind-blowing, but there's actually a lot of it, and it's so hidden, it only makes it more interesting to try and hunt down. And number 2 is Bloodborne, and yeah, it's kind of cheating to have 2 From Software games on this list, but people are absolutely obsessed with the lore of Bloodborne. Even though it's only one game, it's some of the creepiest, most mysterious, and mind-bending stuff out there. There's something about the game's themes of humanity's almost self-destructive need for answers in an uncaring universe that makes the hunt for lore in this game so satisfying. I mean, the game's basically laughing in your face as you try to piece this bizarre story together, but nobody cares, they just want to figure it out even though there's no concrete answers. An interesting thing about Bloodborne is that as you explore the world, your character gains something called insight, which is basically a measure of how much you come to understand the true nature of the world. The lore supports that. At first, everything starts out straightforward enough, with you hunting werewolves and other gothic creatures before the veil of the world slowly starts to part and you start seeing increasingly bizarre things. The game itself gets more abstract, and so does the lore. Everything is so vague and mixed up with metaphors that it's hard to tell what's even supposed to be real, and the more you think about the game, the stranger your thoughts seem to get. That's all to say that Bloodborne is a really unique game where the lore does a great job putting you in the same mindset as the characters inside the game. Talking about lore of this game makes people sound like weirdos who inhabit the world, muttering to themselves like madmen about the eyes inside their brains. Few games have lore quite as nightmarish but engrossing as this one, and it really takes the mysteries of the Dark Souls series to the next level, and that by itself is pretty damn impressive. And finally, at number 1 is the Elder Scrolls series, especially the really weird older stuff. Like, come on, did you really think we'd leave the Elder Scrolls series off this list? No other series has lore as deep, as complex, and as numerous as this series. It's a game series with mind-blowing lore for 2 reasons. For one thing, there is a ton of it. There are books everywhere, each one containing multiple pages and often multiple volumes of the same story, so these things can get pretty damn long. The amount in Skyrim itself is nuts. There are 820 unique pieces of literature lying around, with 307 books that are purely for lore, and that's one game. On word count alone, the Elder Scrolls series dwarfs anything else out there. But it's not just the amount or the quality, though most of it is great and pretty well written, but it can also be pretty crazy when it wants to be. There are so many mind-blowing little tidbits you can discover on your own, like the fact that the 2 moons aren't actually moons, but the remains of a dead god, and the fact they look like moons is our mortal perception can't actually fathom their true forms. That's actual lore from the series. Another crazy one, if you've played these games, you know about the Dwemer and their robots, which can still be found in ancient ruins all over the place. But did you know that there is even more advanced stuff in the lore? Like things called sunbirds, which were literally made from the sun and could travel into space and gather celestial minerals. Like that's a real thing in this world. This is a series with a concept where you can basically become the one from the Matrix called Chim. It's nuts. If you want to get really esoteric with your Elder Scrolls lore, look at anything written by Michael Kirkblade for Morrowind, especially the 36 Lessons of Vivek, which are just trippy as hell. The Elder Scrolls series has everything you could possibly want with the lore. It's deep, it's well written, and there's tons of it, and it can be absolutely nuts when it wants to. That's all for today. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable all notifications. And as always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero. We'll see you next time right here on Gameranx.